Some men just want to watch the world burn. I don't. I like the world as a place that helps me acquire cakes and omelettes. But of course, as a human, I enjoy destruction, whether that's the flickering of flames encroaching around objects or just glass smashing in fabulous ways. Or just the gradual decay of my own self-respect as I find myself playing Cookie Clicker, a diabolical game that devours weeks of your life in exchange for endless, awful jokes. Arguably, all video games are a massive waste of time, but there's something especially futile about games like these. Games where you sit and click to make numbers purely for the sake of numbers. Endorphins for the endorphin god. Endless, aimless progress. Today I'd like to talk about what happens when these games stop being aimless. And I'd like to ask a question. What happens when these games become too good at manipulating us? Now, first things first, when I talk about legislation, the past of video games, although very short, has been plagued with conversations about legislation, about bans, about this is not allowed, and they've been, frankly, overwhelmingly silly, brought up by people who don't understand the medium or the industry or very much at all. However, now we're in a position where people who do understand the medium are likely to have to start thinking about conversations about legislation, but not legislation to do with content. You know, tits and violence were A, not a new evil, and B, they're not going anywhere. It's not really that much of a moral problem. The moral problem we might come up against quite soon is actually legislation to do with the very systems and mechanics that video games employ. Like most idealistic Muppets, I used to think gamification was a brilliant thing. I mean, you take something that's already quite boring, you make it more fun, and you add this layer of motivation where previously there was none. But motivation isn't where it ends. Over the past decade, we've seen unscrupulous dickheads gathering tons of data about player habits that they've then ruthlessly and hugely successfully used to engineer incredibly manipulative systems that play us like a tiny kazoo. And this is the bit that science fiction AI predictions mostly didn't think of. We were so preoccupied with the idea and fear of computers being able to match human intelligence in the future that we didn't clock that in some regards, the human brain isn't actually that complicated. Just a few twiddles here and some bright flashes there, and wham presto, you've just turned the player into a subservient goon who will happily log in every day, largely on the promise of imaginary fruit. Now, if we're just looking at games, it's a little bit dark, but it's really just another symptom of late game capitalism. You know, what you're going to do, etc., etc. But when you look at people outside of games using these techniques, it gets a little bit more worrying, especially when you look at how effectively large corporations and governments use television during the 21st century in order to influence opinions. Imagine those same bodies working to influence behaviour. Oh, don't be silly. Why is this man being so silly, you might think. But you might also be the sort of person who thinks that advertising doesn't work on you, despite endless, overwhelming research that, yes, it works on everyone. And if you're still not clear on this and you're still rolling your eyes, you might want to go and watch my video from last year about the futility of trying to remove politics from video games, which covers all that stuff in a bit more detail. There'll be a link in the description. Because gamification has quickly moved on from being a fun idea to a cold, hard science. Massive games like Candy Crush Saga or League of Legends means that fresh data is constantly being dredged up and crunched, boiling down the techniques of human manipulation into a highly refined, complex art. This isn't just happening in games, of course. Data is the new god of Silicon Valley. And there are reasons that social media platforms are constantly moving stuff around or tweaking things. Now, this data only provides feedback on a very small slice of human behaviour, but despite the focus, the scope of this data is nonetheless incredible. And as this information is being gathered by corporations rather than scientific researchers, there are far few moral codes currently in play. But listen, it isn't a problem that video games companies are collecting all of this data about human behaviour. The problem is where this data goes. So Activision bought King, which means all of the learnings and data from Candy Crush Saga will go towards making people spend more time and money in games like Call of Duty, Skylanders and Destiny. It's not the end of the world. It's fine. But with companies like Riot being bought by Tencent, a Chinese company who do a lot of work for the Chinese government, who, in case you hadn't heard, aren't exactly the nicest of dudes. You've got to start asking questions about where this data is who owns this data and who might have access to this data in the future. Especially when Riot, because of League of Legends, had this huge community of quite caustic people, and quite rightly invested a lot of time and money into working out how they could reform problem players into better behaved, more respectful, more controllable gamers. But jokes aside, it is not a case of pointing fingers at this stage. It's not a case of saying this is happening, it's just the fact that this is going to happen at some point. And at some point we are going to need some form of legislation to protect human minds from certain types of man-made algorithms which are able to effectively manipulate us. But I mean, how would that even work? With something like gambling, which is legislated in many countries, it's cut and dry. Is this gambling? Yes. Is this gambling? No. How do we cleanly identify a similarly addictive assault on our brains when it's composed of so many tiny aggressors, a swarm of details impeccably designed to maintain our attention, and in doing so, maintain control? And in the meantime, I think it's worth looking at the current pieces of work that deal with the issue of this impending disaster. It might not be intentional, but there's something strangely perfect about the unfolding plot of Cookie Clicker, in which the army of adorable grandmas you hired to bake cookies are transmuted into ancient horrors, turning the world into an endless care home designed by John Carpenter. But you still keep playing, even though doing so is inherently destructive. You know it's a waste of your time. And you know that continuing to play is only making things worse, is destroying this fictional world, and yet you do. And then there's Little Inferno, one of my favourite things in a while, where you just sit in front of a chimney and burn things. You burn everything, and people send you letters and you read them and you burn them. And you just watch things burn. For no other reason. But if we are all rolling towards a dystopian cyberpunk nightmare in which governments control us with game-based systems, does it all have to be sad? Come on, Matt, cheer up. Yeah, alright, well I'm sad to admit that Wii Fit was the first time I ever tried actually committing to exercise and realising that, hey, it's actually a good thing. And Rock Band taught me how to do different beats with my legs and my hands, which has proved fantastic for when I'm sitting on the London Underground bashing out a cool beat on my knees while other commuters look at me and hope that I might die. But my favourite example of addictive gameplay loops actually providing a benefit to my life came from a game on the Nintendo DS. Chibi Robo Park Patrol was a game that got me into recycling. The repetitive positive feedback loop of picking stuff up and throwing it away, combined with a genuinely touching story about toys that had lost their self-esteem after being discarded for newer, shiny things. It was an experience that changed my behaviour in the actual real world. It made me think about consumer culture and obsolescence. Made me start keeping a hold of things that I would have thrown away otherwise. It got into my head and it made me better. Thank you, little robot. And the benefits of this largely missed my generation, but Minecraft has clearly been hugely formative and largely positive. I'd argue that providing infinite Lego for about £6 has been a massively important step towards equality in the world of children's cognitive development, and that's huge. It may yet be a few years before the generation who most benefited from Minecraft have the experience and eloquence to properly explain that, but I suspect that growing up being addicted to a game about construction, collaboration and trust might have had a fairly substantial impact. Well, they got Minecraft. I, on the other hand, grew up with Baldur's Gate 2, which means I'm excellent at identifying medieval weaponry and frequently use too many words. So it isn't all doom and gloom and embers, but it is a problem quietly bubbling in the background that the video games industry is quietly fueling. And perhaps these manipulative systems will be used to make the world a better place, but whose perspective of better will we be using? And that's my piece. I think it's a problem. But what can we do as media or players or publishers? Well, I think one of the main things we can do is maybe think twice about rolling our eyes. Next time somebody says that video games are addictive, maybe don't just go, no. Maybe think, well, partly that's true, because we know that partly that is true. It's not that they're so addictive that you can't choose whether or not you want to play them and they're going to take over your life. All of that stuff is still rubbish. But I think that we all know that part of the reason that video games are magic is the way that they're able to tickle our brains and keep us coming back and keep us having fun, and that's great. But when these systems flutter off into the real world and start causing problems, the only people who are going to be able to really identify that, the only people who are going to spot that and be able to call it out for what it is, are people who know games. So we have a responsibility to be the people that do that. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate your time. And if you've really enjoyed this little message, thought, then maybe share it with somebody online, on social medias, etc. I don't know what kids do these days, but that's fine. I'm Matt. I run a website called coolghost.net. It's where our videos live. We've got loads of great stuff. You should check it out. And you know what? If you've really enjoyed this video, you might consider supporting our work because it's all crowdfunded, and you can go to patreon.com/coolghosts. But once again, thanks for your time.